Okay, good morning, everyone. Everyone there, you can hear okay? All right, I'm seeing some smiles. How many people on here are morning people? I'm just curious. A couple of morning people. Good, good, very good. I'm not, so I was just wondering who those people were that are morning people. So the morning folks will keep us entertained, I guess, for a little while. Anyway, welcome to this session about reimagining schools. We're going to have a conversation today with some esteemed folks, and I want to introduce myself to you first. My name is Rena Doyle. I am co-founder of CAAASA Consulting, working with the two school districts that are represented today in today's panel. My colleague is...
Good morning, everyone. I am Gail Watts, also co-founder of CAAASA. Rena and I are a team that have been working together for, well, decades now, so it's been a while. Good morning to everyone. Welcome.
So you're going to get an opportunity to hear a really different approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the quotes, you'll hear a couple of quotes during this time, but one of the quotes is that if the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different outcomes. And although, if you have been in education for a long time, you know that there's several sort of flavor of the month that may come through, right, around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know that there are some changes that happen through these programs, but these two school districts took an opportunity to challenge their own systems, and they're going to talk to you about how they challenge their systems. So not just a program, but a way of looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion entirely differently. So if you want to go ahead and project, Gail. So we're going to spend some time, you have an opportunity to speak to administrators from the Santa Monica Malibu School District and from the Pasadena Unified School District today. And we are going to facilitate that conversation. You will have an opportunity to ask some questions today as well, or make comments and things like that with these administrators. So today, we are all going to introduce ourselves. Gail and I already did so. And then Brian, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. My name is Brian McDonald. I'm the superintendent of schools here in the Pasadena Unified School District. This is my 10th year in the district, my 7th year as superintendent, having spent the first 3 years as the chief academic officer. I happen to be the longest serving superintendent in over 20 years. So I consider that to be a significant accomplishment when you consider the importance of leadership sustainability in any organization. So I'm happy to be with you today, happy to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing in the PUSD, and just look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Brian. And from Santa Monica Malibu Unified School District, we have Florence Culpepper. Florence, if you'll introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Florence Culpepper, and I'm the principal of Lincoln Middle School here in Santa Monica. This is my 6th year as principal at Lincoln, my 10th year in this school district. And prior to that, I was in LA Unified, and I'm originally from Alabama. So really excited to be here and share our work with you all and hear your thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good morning, Steve. If you could introduce yourself as well.
Good morning. It's great to see everybody today. Thank you for coming. Steve Richardson. I'm the principal at John Adams Middle School in Santa Monica, Malibu. It's my finishing up my 8th year as a principal here, 11th year in the district. I've been in Lawndale, I've been in LAUSD, and I'm really happy to be here to talk about this important work.
Wonderful. Thank you to everyone and our panel members. So we're going to start with their story. And I talked in the beginning about this being sort of a very new and unique approach and a different approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you're going to hear parts of their entire story throughout this session. But we're going to start at the beginning, kind of give you some background about both of the school districts in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So Santa Monica, Malibu, if you would start first, please.
Sure. Thank you, Rena. So I mentioned that I'm finishing my 8th year as middle school principal, and prior to that, I spent 16 years as both an elementary school teacher and coach and principal. And if you've ever worked at an elementary school and you've seen the kindergarten yard, or if you're a parent, or if you've driven by a school, you've seen a familiar scene at a kindergarten yard. And the beauty of that yard is it's characterized by creativity and inhibition and laughter and some tears. Of course, it's kindergarten, but more laughter and more smiles than tears. And I just think of the smiling faces that would come so eagerly to school every day. And when I see someone now as an adult, and I see other adults who are struggling, or I see a student who is struggling and they're not smiling anymore. And I can't help but ask myself what took the smile off their face. And, through this journey, it's become very clear that our system takes the smile off people's faces, particularly our kids of color. I think of, a middle school African-American student sitting in a class who you can tell wishes they were anywhere but that place. And what does our system do to that poor baby? And this has been part of my journey in kind of, seeing my part in this, right? And our district has a journey. And one story I like to share is almost 2 decades ago, I was in a UCLA getting my administrative credential, and we had a visitor. And I was working in LAUSD at the time in Los Angeles Unified, and we had a visitor from Santa Monica, Malibu, where I now work. And it was Dr. Sylvia Rousseau, and many of you may know Dr. Rousseau. She's a former superintendent in LAUSD, a former principal, a former superintendent here as well. And she came in with a group of people to really take on the 2 schools within a school phenomenon at Santa Monica High School. The one experience that white and Asian kids were having, and the other experience that our Black and brown kids were having. And they brought an initiative that was really exciting. And it gave me just great hope that something could be done to really go after the achievement engagement gap at this intractable problem. And now, fast forward 17 years later, I'm working in the district, and we're having the same conversation. And it's frustrating and it's disheartening. And I'm not the only one who feels that way in our district. And because of that, we kind of came together and decided we're going to do something about it. I'm going to let Florence share that.
Yeah, and the reality is that 60 years is not really a long time. And it's about that length of time where Ruby Bridges was trying to go to school and get an education and had to be escorted by armed guards, this little 6-year-old girl, because of the rage and the anger from the white residents who did not want her in their schools. And so we as an admin team know that by design, our educational system is designed to hurt our BIPOC students. We were not meant to be a part of it. And we clearly recognize that if we continued with business as usual in Santa Monica, that we were complicit in this educational system that by design hurts BIPOC students. So we knew we had to do something different so that in another 17 years, there wouldn't be some other group talking about this inspirational story that they heard, but about the outcomes that have resulted from us trying to disrupt and change the system.
Thank you so much. You'll hear more from Santa Monica and Malibu about their journey, but Brian is going to talk a little bit about the history of Pasadena Unified School District. Brian?
Thank you, Rita. I'm sorry to say that the Pasadena Unified School District was the first district west of the Mississippi to be court-ordered to desegregate. And with that came a lot of issues. We had white flight, we had middle-class flight. When the strategy that was employed was implemented, that strategy was busing. And you know, back in those days, there were two approaches. It was either busing or bandit schools. And our district chose busing. And this resulted in a desegregated school district that really did thrive for a number of years until the court order was rescinded. Now, the history of racism in this town goes far beyond that. You know, back in the 50s, as a matter of fact, the school board opened up the Pasadena High School on the east side of town, and that was designed to create a school where predominantly white students could attend, leaving the predominantly students of color in the northwest side of town. The board also followed that action in the early 60s, 1964, as a matter of fact, when they built another high school on the south side of town to accomplish the same end. And over time, you know, all of these actions have had a significant impact on the district. Another thing that the Board of Education did was to establish what was called fundamental schools. And that was the start of the open enrollment process that we still have today. And that was another way of segregating kids, because our students had to go through that open enrollment process. And of course, you know, the system was set up so that only a certain kind of student would end up in these fundamental schools. So we're still dealing with the vestiges of these actions of racism to this day. And one of the things that we're dealing with is the inordinate number of non-public options that exist in our city. I think there are somewhere around 54 to 57 private schools and charter schools, which in effect siphons off students so that we only attract about 51% of the school-age kids. So in this very affluent town, our demographic makeup in terms of students is around 64% free and reduced lunch. The large majority of those students happen to be students of Latin descent. So again, we're still dealing with all of these issues. The issue of funding. We have so many schools relative to the number of students that we have, because schools were established in neighborhoods across the city so that students could remain segregated. So there's a lot of history here. I could go on all day talking about this, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So as you hear these stories, you hear that racism is deeply rooted in all aspects of their systems. And so as we consult with these school districts, we realize that it's deeply rooted. And so in order to address or be anti-racist or diversity or equity and inclusion, you have to get to the root of the racism in these school districts. So take a look at this quote. Every system is exquisitely designed to produce the results it gets. These outcomes of racism within the educational system is not by accident. It is built into the design. And as we work with school districts, it's really interesting for us to hear or to see when a melanated person of color who is part of the system and working in the system realizes that the system is asking them to continue to uphold racism within the system. And so this is not a blame game, right, on people of color who may be empowered to do the change. But if you came through this same system, you're now being asked to disrupt a system that may have worked for you, that you're being asked to disrupt a system that taught you what you know. And that's a difficult task to take on this system, because the system is really good. It's been around since prior to the United States even being the United States. The public education system has survived in doing what it does. So in order to disrupt that system, you have to start at the foundation. And so that's where these two school districts took a different approach.
A different approach is actually to create a lens around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we know that in education in particular, you hear equity all over the place. Equity initiatives, we have an equity coordinator, equity, equity, equity. But frequently, when you ask people, well, what do you mean by equity? There is no common understanding of what that means. And the concept of equity then is divorced from the concept of diversity and inclusion. So we suggest that actually these three are very different concepts, but when they work together as a lens, it becomes a different way to view everything, to view decisions, to view work, and it doesn't matter your role in a district. This can become a lens for how do you approach everything that you do. Now, a lens is different than a program. And we know that programs are, again, very common in public education. We've got a program for almost everything. And while programs can have an impact in particular areas, they don't fundamentally change the system itself. So if you want a different outcome, you need to actually change that system. And we'd like to suggest that creating this lens that gets adopted and embedded in the system and everybody gets educated about becomes the new way to do the work, to the new way to educate kids through this lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It becomes systemic and therefore sustainable.
So when we say lens, we literally mean changing the way you see the work that you do. And so I don't know if any of you all are photographers, but you know when you change a lens, it's to change the picture, right? You could get a very different picture. You can also see things you haven't seen before when you change your lens. And so what these two school districts have been working on is how do we change the lens? How do we see things that we've been taught actually not to see? And how can we disrupt the systems that continuously give us the same outcomes decade after decade after decade? And so in doing this work, when we consult with them, there are 4 pillars to sort of keep in mind in developing this lens. The first one is healing, that in both of the stories that you heard racial trauma. There's racial trauma in these schools. And one of the things that other countries do really well that have suffered ethnic or racial trauma is they actually take the time to heal, right? So I think of countries like South Africa, Rwanda, Cambodia. One of the things that they do is to heal. And healing doesn't mean forgiving, but it does mean acknowledging, at least acknowledging that there was a negative impact or a bad impact that occurred. Many times, I don't know if you've been in a relationship where people talk about healing and moving forward. What they're talking about is you not pointing out what they did, right? We're just going to move forward and act like it didn't happen. The human brain has trouble with that. Until you acknowledge the pain you caused on me, doesn't mean I have to forgive you. But until you acknowledge that pain, it is difficult to move forward. And for decades, the United States has swept oppression, particularly oppression of little children that are not white, that are melanated children, under the rug. And so this approach must include healing, which means school districts must acknowledge the harm that has been done and being done to these children. Change has to actually happen. I don't know how many of you all had statements come out from your school boards after the murder of George Floyd. Right? Now we can argue all day if those statements are good or they're bad. Are they strong enough? Are they not strong enough? But the question is, does it mean change? Right? Because that's what the Black and Latinx and Indigenous and Asian community want. We want change. So is there actually change? If not, it's just statements on a piece of paper. Truth and knowledge. How many of you all are finding out things that you're saying today? How come I'm X amount of years old and I'm just now finding out about the role that Black or Latinx or Indigenous people played in history? How did I get to this age and I didn't know this? So there has to be a discovery of truth and knowledge. And then also understanding that there's an individual journey and there's also a system journey. So we're talking about organizational change here and the ability for the school district to go through a full organizational change. And the lens is sort of the foundational part of that organizational change. So now, what did Santa Monica, Malibu, and Pasadena do? So one of the first things they realized is that they're not all speaking the same language. Remember, Gail talked about, you hear equity. Equity is thrown all over the place, but it's rare that there's a common definition of what that means. And there's a rare understanding of what those behaviors mean. And so they started to put together, each one of them, what those words mean. What do they really mean? What does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean? So we're going to go to Santa Monica, Malibu, and we're going to share their definitions, because it's important that it's not some Wikipedia definition, right? But they're going to share how they came up with their definitions and what's important in these definitions for them.
Thank you. So, it's important to note that we have the support going into this work of our superintendent, of our assistant super ed services, and our union president. Steve and I actually met with them and with Gail and Rena really early in this process before our core group of DEI change agents came together, being all the middle school administrators and one high school administrator who's attached to a middle school as well. And so working together, first we started with our core group, our definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, worked through those together, which in itself was work, just trying to figure out how do we even see this being the seats that we all sit in, where we come from, different communities, different backgrounds. And we came up with our 3 common definitions for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and our litmus test, which you'll see in a moment as well. But these were really refined. We went through many iterations to get to this. And then we also actually brought what we thought was our final ones to some trusted colleagues back at our sites, just to see how they landed with them. If they were to see this and hear it from their seat, from their role, how did these things land with them, and what behaviors did they think would demonstrate diversity, equity, and inclusion from the seats in which they serve our community. Then we actually took our work to a small group of board members, our board leadership. We met with some district administrators and coordinators, some other school site administrators, because our core group was just the middle school leadership. And we also met with many parent affinity groups to help them understand what we wanted to do, since this lens is very different than bringing in a program, which is the usual approach. And we wanted to clarify any questions, things that came up, some of the language that we use, BIPOC. Some people have feelings about that. So we wanted to kind of put all that out there and see how these things landed with them, and get their feedback and ask for their support in the work that we wanted to do as a middle school team. And they were very supportive, actually, and really wanted to kind of fast track some things, some of the parent groups that we were talking to, and it actually fit in nicely with some of the initiatives and goals that they had for our community of BIPOC families as well. And then we did a presentation to the school board and community, asking them to adopt our definitions, our litmus test, and commit to an education campaign to make sure we could make sure it's not just this core group of people who know these definitions and we don't just have them up on a poster, but that everyone understands them deeply and understands how you live them. You don't just say them, but it's through your actions and your behaviors that you demonstrate diversity, equity, and inclusion in our decision-making and the way that we interact for authentic interactions and inclusion of all of our families and kids, specifically our BIPOC families and kids.
In terms of the three definitions, thank you, Florence. There's a couple, I think, important things to know here. One, it gives you common language. But what we've also realized is when schools or districts or individuals look to address the engagement gap or achievement gap, they often will address the diversity and inclusion part, but they miss the equity part. And Gail mentioned it earlier. And the part that I want you to zero in on is that last couple lines in equity where it says to address gaps that are a result of systemic inequalities. And without doing that, there is no healing. Without acknowledging that piece, there's no space for healing in there. And you also lose the power of whatever you're trying to do. So here's an example. A lot of the districts in this room probably have done the same thing over the last decade or more, where if you look at the high school and you look at advanced placement classes, they've taken away a lot of barriers. Okay, so there used to be a lot of barriers that kept BIPOC kids out of these AP classes. And so in the name of equity, for in a variety of definitions of equity, people have said, well, let's take those barriers away and let's include and have a diverse representation in our AP classes. All good. But the results over time have not increased at the same rate for our white and Asian kids. And part of that problem is they didn't recognize that kids were not in these classes because the system worked against them being in these classes, not starting in high school, but starting in elementary school. So your results aren't going to change unless you understand that the whole system is inequitable and you go back and fix the problems that are happening in the elementary school and the middle school and the high school if you want to get a different result. So the power of these three together is something that I really want you to take away today.
And really quick, Steve and Florence, before you move forward, Gail, these definitions talk a little bit about the action that is required from you all on these.
Yeah, so I think when we're doing things, we need to think about what are the best practices attached to these definitions. So it can't be a compliance kind of framework that you're using, that we need to be thinking of if we have inclusion, what does meaningful inclusion look like? For example, a lot of people of color who come to meetings in our district sometimes feel they have to hide parts of themselves. I know there are a lot of people in this room who have felt that and aren't able to engage authentically the way they would like to engage. Feel like they have to hide parts of themselves. Sometimes the diversity piece, people come in and say, oh, well, we have everybody in the room and now I'm just going to do the plan that I had in my mind anyway. It requires authentic listening. It requires authentic ways to engage people. Everybody showing up at a meeting at 9 a.m. isn't going to, achieve a DEI objective. So really thinking about each of these definitions and thinking about, so what are the behaviors? What are the behaviors that will support this? But also, what are the behaviors that work against this?
Yeah, and people know when people are just there to be able to check a box and say, oh, we brought this to this committee, or we brought this to this group, or there were parents from these communities there. And so we definitely were not looking for anything like that. We really want to make sure that folks feel like what you have to say is valued, your contributions are worthwhile, and we really want to design something with you in mind, because clearly what we've been doing has not been working for all of our families.
You will notice that these definitions are definitions that, as they complete or do their education campaign to all employees, it's something all employees could recite, could understand, could talk about what are these behaviors that support. It doesn't matter what you do in the district. So it was purposefully not used with a bunch of legalese or sounding too much academic. It was something that everyone could understand and apply, right? It was purposefully done that way. So then there is a discussion about a litmus test. What questions do you ask the system or of yourself in order to support these definitions? So if you all would walk them through your 3 quick questions here.
So this is a brief document right here, but a very, very powerful one. And when we think of a litmus test, we say, well, what are we trying to assess here or evaluate? So you could use this for something new that your school or your district is considering, or it could be a way to evaluate current practices as well, which is something that if you're going to reimagine a system, you need to reevaluate your practices. And so it's 3 simple questions. First one seems standard in any educational setting. Is it good for kids? That should always be your first question, right? And we do a lot of things we realized that were good for kids. But then we went to question number 2 and we thought, boy, some of the things that we're doing that are good for kids are good for some kids, but they're at the expense of BIPOC kids. And our last question is it sustainable? Meaning, is something we're doing so tied to money or a specific person that if the money dries up or that person goes away, that the whole thing falls apart? And so these are the 3 questions. And this is a living, breathing document that should be adjusted over time as you go through this journey. An example of using the litmus test would be, so we looked at our school at accelerated classes, at tracking. And we had the last kind of piece that we were really focusing on, other than math, which has been tricky and we haven't totally solved the math tracking issue, but we had an accelerated English class. And you could walk into an English class, it was in 8th grade, and you could tell if it was accelerated or not based on the color of the skin of the kids in the class. And so we looked at data and we said, well, let's say, hey, is this good for kids? And so we looked at how the accelerated classes did and how those that weren't accelerated did. And we learned actually that those who we thought were benefiting from acceleration, it really didn't move the needle a whole lot on achievement. And we also learned that when we looked at our kids who were primarily BIPOC kids who are not accelerated, it hurt them disproportionately. They not only didn't gain a lot, they on average lost quite a few points as it related to standardized testing. And so we stopped doing it. We used the litmus test to evaluate a current practice and we stopped. We then had to go back and say, well, how do we make sure everybody has a rich experience? And we had to make some adjustments in 6th grade and 7th grade to achieve a goal in 8th grade where everybody had an accelerated opportunity. Everyone received the same accelerated opportunity.
It's important to note that as Santa Monica Malibu was doing their presentations to parent groups and even to the school board, that they pointed out that equity is not the same thing as equality. And that it's also very much deeper than the meme that a lot of people see about the kids on boxes trying to look over a fence. That's a good way of introducing the topic of equity, but equity is way deeper than that meme, of course. So now we're going to go to the definitions that Pasadena Unified School District put together. And you should know there was both of these foundational definitions. It took several months to put these together. This is not a quick process. You have a system that's very old, and to disrupt it and change it is going to be a journey, as we stated before. So Brian, if you could walk them through your definitions and litmus tests, please.
Certainly. So before I do that, I think I should give some historical context, that the events that led us to this point in time. So somewhere around 2014, based on what we were seeing, we were dinged by the state for disproportionality, meaning that we had a disproportionate number of African-American males that were identified as emotionally disturbed or labeled as emotionally disturbed. And one of the things that we did in an effort to arrest that problem is to embark on what we call critical race conversations. We brought a consultant in to help us with that process. And we brought everybody to the table. We started with the site leaders, and then we went to teachers and so forth. And while we got a lot done, and out of this work, we even hired an equity coordinator, and she's actually on this call today, Dr. Tredell Skinner. What we found was that we had a difficult time embedding the work in the culture of the district. We had a difficult time embedding this new way of looking at things in the culture of the district. And I have to apologize to Dr. Skinner, because in many ways, she was carrying this work by herself. She didn't have the support from the executive level, from the governance team level, meaning the board and superintendent. She didn't have the support that was necessary to really move the needle on this issue. But now when the George Floyd situation happened, where he was murdered right in front of our eyes, we now had an opportunity to really be a little bit more bold. And so Rena and Gail came in to help us with this effort. And this is a joint effort with the administration and the bargaining units, specifically the United Teachers of Pasadena. So once Gail and Rena were brought on board, we embarked on this very intentional process. So we convened a committee, a DEI committee, and it's made up of all the bargaining units, teachers, administrators, and so forth. And we embarked on this process of, changing the way that we view things. And so we went through a pretty long process of formulating our definitions for diversity, equity, and inclusion. The process was so deliberate and so intentional that I got a little bit concerned, because I thought maybe we were moving a little bit too slowly. But we were going at the right pace, and it worked out. So here you can see, I won't read them to you, but here you can see our definitions, making sure that we value the multiple identities and that they're represented in our school structure. Then equity is ensuring that there are avenues of success for our students and staff, because this work in our eyes is not just about students, even though they are the main focus. But we have staff as well who really have felt disenfranchised in many ways. And so we wanted to include them in our thinking and in the way that we wanted to move the organization. And then as far as inclusion is concerned, and I read this wonderful quote, that inclusion is not simply a way of counting people, but making people count. And this is what this is all about. It's making sure that a person's whole identity is appreciated and celebrated and supported, and that all their experiences and contributions are valued. In many ways, a lot of our employees, and students, especially those of color, simply do not feel included in things. They do not feel like their voices are heard. They do not feel like they're valued. They do not feel like their culture is valued. And so we have to be very intentional about changing the way that we operate, tearing down those systems that cause them to feel this way.
If we can go to the litmus tests.
And so here we have the litmus test. And I want to say thanks to Santa Monica Malibu, because we're kind of using them as a model with the support of Gail and Rena. So we're in the nascent stages of our work. So I really appreciate the fact that they've gone through this process. And so we're using it as a guide. In terms of the litmus test, we're thinking about the intersectional identities, because very often when we think about a program or when we think about some change that we want to implement, we think about it in terms of African-American students or Hispanic students or whatever, but we don't think about sometimes how all of those different identities intersect. So we have to think about that in everything that we do and make sure that no harm comes to anyone because of any action that we take. Then the second portion of the litmus test talks about actions to ensure avenues of success for BIPOC and marginalized students and employees. And it's what I just said. We think about the actions that we're taking, and we want to make sure that our actions are not harmful to any student or employee that falls into this category. And does the action intentionally contribute to the belonging of these groups of students and employees, and how do we know? So we always want to make sure that we identify what the measure of success will be. And I want to give you an example of how this new way of doing things is benefiting the district. So because of declining enrollment, every year we go through this process of reducing teachers and staff. And we usually don't think much about it in terms of, the different things that happen in the process. We take the action to the board. Once it's approved, we go through the whole process of giving the RIF notices, and then of course the resulting bumping occurs. But this year, because of this work, we decided to take a closer look. And after talking to one of the principals at one of the sites, we decided to take a closer look at how this action could potentially harm students of color. What we found at one of our schools was that the last remaining African-American teacher was going to be bumped or moved to another site. So those students of color, especially African-American students, would then not have a role model on campus, not have somebody to look up to, not see someone that looks like them. And that really was an eye-opener for me. So then we sprung into action, and we decided, no, we can't make that, we can't allow that to happen. And so we're keeping that teacher where she is. And now we're going to look at all of the school sites to make sure that a similar thing doesn't occur. So that's where we are with our litmus test and our definitions. And we're taking these to the board, as a matter of fact, this evening for adoption and for approval. And what we're asking the board to do is to give the stamp of approval, and actually not only give the stamp of approval, but adopt this in how they operate as well. When they're taking action, apply the litmus test. Think about how the actions at the governance level will affect students of color and other marginalized groups.
Thank you so much. Now, one of the things that we encounter in our 27, 28 years of consulting with school districts is that school districts want to head straight to things like curriculum, or they want to head to things like hiring, and and we're proposing that there's some foundational things that have to happen before you can even set some metrics to be able to measure diversity, equity, and inclusion, including defining those things. So both of these school districts are going through organizational assessments through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's their structural part of the assessment. And then they're also participating, going through a cultural assessment as it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it comes to no surprise to you all, because you all do assessments and things like that all the time, that there should be at least an assessment of where you are now. What is your culture in diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what is your organizational structure like? Because sometimes there are ways in which we do not realize that unintentionally the structure may be causing oppression, particularly of African-American kids. So we're going to go into a question mode for a bit with the panel, and then we are going to open it up for you to have some questions. Keeping in mind that if you ask questions about specific programs, they are going to direct you back to the ways they may be looking at certain programs through the definitions and the litmus tests first. So it's important to realize, again, you don't go straight to programs until you set this foundation. So I'm curious, Santa Monica, Malibu, what outcomes have you had so far? How are people thinking? How are people thinking differently now? What have you noticed?
So I would say that we're still in the really formative stages of our work. We've begun our educational campaign by rolling out our DEI definitions and litmus tests to select staff members through some targeted trainings with our Trivacy consultants. We've begun conversations and dialogues on race with our core team and some other district administrators and coordinators who want to gain more skill with facilitating those conversations and leading their staffs through this work. And we personally are working to apply the lens and definitions in our daily work and in the realms that are within our sphere of influence, because our board hasn't yet adopted our definitions and litmus tests. So I feel like that's kind of where we are right now, trying to do the work within our group as we continue to work with our board and our district leadership to adopt and move forward so we can do a larger education campaign. Steve, you want to add anything?
I think just to add, I think it's been well received in a lot of spots, and we haven't lost our jobs yet, so that's a good sign at this point. But we do have board members, I would say 7 of 7 committed to this. There's some learning that needs to happen with our board to really kind of understand seeing this work, the idea of a DEI lens versus a program. There's a little work trying to keep every other problem in the world from being solved by our litmus test. But in general, it's been really, really well received. And we feel very optimistic that this will get approved, our definitions and our litmus test. The other piece would just be that litmus test has allowed us to be more consistent in our decision making. Sometimes at a school, you hear the loudest voices and it can sway you one way or another. These definitions and this litmus test has allowed us to kind of plant our feet firmly in the ground in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and be consistent in our decision making and doing things that are good for all kids, not just for some kids.
Yeah, and all the administrators, we're all committed to it, no matter what happens. We're moving forward with this work, with, like I said, with what's within our sphere of influence.
Thank you so much. Brian, I know you talked about some outcomes a minute ago. Are there any other outcomes you'd like to add so far in this process?
Yeah, I think this process has really galvanized the district. The site leaders, the principals, have really embraced this work, and they're, participating in book studies and discussions and so forth. One of the things that I take great pleasure in talking about is the fact that there is a teacher in the district. I would consider her my nemesis, so to speak. So she would come to the board meetings and point the finger and, really criticize us. And she sent this really heartfelt email to me that almost moved me to tears, because she apologized for her behavior over the years and resolved to change her behavior, but not only that, to stand up where she see instances of discrimination or racism among her colleagues. And that really is what this is all about. Helping people to see things in a different light, to change the way that they think, to change the way that they act. So this is something, this is proof that this is working. Another outcome that I see is that the board is really united around this effort. And a lot of this started with the call to action by the board. One of the board members championed a resolution in support of Black students and Latino students. And that really gave us the energy that we needed to embrace the effort and go out and get it done. So what I see happening now is, once the board adopts the definitions and the litmus test, that we will embark on our education campaign to try to get everybody on the same page and to help them understand what this is all about. I have to admit that I've come a far way since we've started with this work. You know, I'm Jamaican, I'm from another country, I'm middle-aged, you know, so my thinking hadn't quite evolved, you know, and since I've been a part of this effort, I'm starting to see things a different way, you know, and that really makes a difference. You know, when we can get people to reflect and to think about, you know, some of the things that they have believed and just think about some of their actions. And if through this process, it causes them to change for the better, then that is a good thing. And so I'm excited about where we're going with our process.
Thank you for that. So one of the 4 pillars that Rena mentioned is that it's a journey, right? It's a journey for individuals, but it's also a journey for the system. And, you know, in any journey, there can be bumps in the road, it can be exciting, it can be kind of all those things. So I'm kind of curious as to, in terms of your own journeys and your journeys in this work, what has been frustrating or liberating or both about the process so far? And I'll turn it over to Florence or Steve to start off.
Yeah, frustrations. I think a huge frustration for me has been the otherisms and the politics. And I think that, as many of you have probably seen, and so many other examples in our nation over the past year, that some folks are just really uncomfortable with a singular focus on repairing the harms that have been done to Black people in our nation. And because of that, when you are trying to push something like this forward, where you have that litmus test and that focus on our BIPOC students, the otherisms can potentially be used to distract, to undermine, and throw you off your path. And I feel like it only seems to happen when we're talking about Black or Latinx families. So no one's saying that we don't care about LGBTQI plus students. We have lots of things that are focused on them. We have lots of things that are focused on supporting students who come from different countries and are learning English for the first time. We have things to support students who have physical and cognitive disabilities. But what is really there, what is truly there for our Black families and our Black students when we're talking about this system that has historically served to undermine them, not only in schools, but in our society? People have a really hard time with that. And so I find that to be a frustration, just like with many other things. People want to say, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? Why can't we just acknowledge and move forward and know that we're still going to take care of all these other things? And I think that in our community in particular, that while there are cycles of generational poverty and things like that, in some places, we have a cycle of a response to entitlement that has been really difficult to break. And so sometimes the terms and, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion are co-opted and used as if they are trying to support our BIPOC communities, but they really aren't. So those are some of my frustrations that have come out over this process. And I think that what's been liberating, though, is to have this core group of people that we've been working with on this who really are so committed that we were really all like, well, we're just gonna get fired. You know, like we're gonna be in this together and we're just gonna get fired if we have to, because we just can't be a part of doing this the way that we've always done it. So that has been super liberating, and it's created a really safe space for us to reveal parts of ourselves that we didn't always know about each other, and to be able to share and connect on a deeper level. So that's been super liberating. And I think even having the opportunities to connect around this work with some of those parent affinity groups have been really eye-opening to me, and really allowed me to change some of the ways that I move as a leader in this school and in this district, for sure.
Thank you.
Steve or Brian, would you like to add any frustrations in this process?
Well, what has been frustrating about the process is also what's good about the process, in that we're moving at a very slow and deliberate pace. And while I have a sense of urgency, I also believe that we can't rush this. This is too important. We have to take our time and go one step at a time, one building block at a time, so that in the end, we will have something that's systemic and sustainable, that will benefit our employees and our students. And that's simply it for me as far as frustrations. The rest of it, you know, as an administrator, you just power through it and keep going. As far as what's liberating is, I feel like now, you know, we can really work unimpeded, right? Because, you know, years ago, like I mentioned, when we started the conversation around, you know, our critical race discussions, you know, I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was waiting for this backlash. Thank God it never came. But now I feel like the time is right, and we must act. We must seize this opportunity to make meaningful change. And for me, that's liberating. I don't sense any backlash. We're all united around this effort. And so that is liberating for me. We could just get the job done. We can just, you know, be unencumbered and unimpeded and just keep moving ahead.
I think, thank you, Brian. I think what I might add is, and it's more of a caveat than anything, the term journey. This is a journey. A lot of people aren't going to want it to be a journey. They're going to want it to be a program, an initiative with an end date. Oh, we did DI, right? Didn't we already do DI? We have to stay on the journey. And, you know, I think it's easy when there are things, maybe even on the grander scale, an election that can feel like the tide has turned and people can get complacent. And I think we just need to, you know, remember that, you know, Donald Trump did not invent racism. It was there 500 years before him. And this journey is not going to end in my lifetime. I'm a little older than a lot of people in this room, but it's not going to end in my lifetime. And we have to frame the work around the fact that this is a journey that we're going to continue to be on, and be vigilant about it and take a different lens through this journey.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why people always want to default to a program is because of this idea that BIPOC students are broken and need to be fixed. And so it's just reinforcing the idea that no, they're not. They come from vibrant cultures. They are positive and vibrant additions to our school communities, and they don't need to be fixed. The system is what is broken and needs to be fixed. So you can't have a program for that. It's the system.
I want to just jump because of time and to give people, I see some questions are coming up on the chat. What school district, I mean, there's some folks probably sitting here thinking, wow, this is completely different. I'd love to start this conversation. What do you think are some of the characteristics of the school district that would be, for lack of a better word, ripe for having this conversation? Brian?
Well, I think you have to have forward-thinking leadership. I mean, it starts there. And quite frankly, as a superintendent, I own it. I own the problems. And I recognize that if meaningful change is to happen, I have to lead it. And as such, it is my job also to bring the board along. And so, I've been working diligently to do that. And thankfully, our board is a forward-thinking board as well. So leadership is important. And keep in mind that this is not a journey that you can travel on alone, right? If you want to go, that African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, take some people on that journey with you. And so I think one of the things that is working for us is that this is not just an initiative by the superintendent, but rather a partnership with the bargaining units, with parents, with students. We have actually what we're calling a student think tank, which is a group of high school students across all the high schools that meet on a regular basis to examine the issue. So for example, they're looking at the curriculum to see whether or not there is enough representation of them in it. And I go to this group and get their input on things, and I intend to continue that. So you have to bring everybody along, and then, finally, it's just creating that culture of that we're going to do this together, and you have to be able to make that case. It just takes one person to stand up and say, you know what, this needs to change. And here's why it needs to change. And here's what we can do to effectuate this change. And I'm inviting people to come along with me on this journey. And it can start at a school site. As you see, we have 2 principals here that are leading this work. We happen to have embarked on this effort at the district level, but it can start at any place in the organization. But I would say strong leadership, that needs to be in place. Without that, you're pretty much going to be dead in the water. But somebody has to step up and lead.
Thank you, Brian. Steve or Florence, do you want to add to this? What do you think are characteristics of a district that is ripe for disrupting systems?
I mean, I think Brian named a lot of it. Building coalition, board support, and they started in a much broader way than we did. We started kind of in the middle and are expanding outwards. So there are different ways to do it. I think when you're taking on something that's super disruptive, it's also important to remember what often happens when people are trying to implement change is, it's ready, aim, fire. So we get ready, get the people, and then we aim, we make the plan, and then we aim some more, and then we keep aiming, and then we aim more, and then we never fire, right? And when too many good ideas die on the vine because of that. And that, that's a white supremacist ideal of perfection that we all fall into that trap in the system. And Michael Fullen talks about it, and he says, rather than ready, aim, fire, try ready, fire, aim. So we get our people together, we get a plan, but we know that we just got to, sometimes you just got to do it. You got to, Brian talked about having courage. You have to just do it, and then we'll aim along the way as well. And if you're ready to come up with if you're waiting for the perfect idea, it's probably not gonna happen.
Florence, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I think they've kind of summed it up. We can go and get questions from our guest.
All right. Great. So if you all would either use the electronic raise your hand or put a question into the chat for the panel members. If you have one specific to a panel member, if you could put their name, but we'll open it up for any comments and or questions that you may have.
So there is a question in the chat about how long is gradualism and can't rush things. And certainly it depends upon the organization and the people who are part of the process, but would anybody like to comment on that?
Well, I think it's, what I said earlier, this is not something that's important. You have to lay the foundation, right? You have to lay the foundation first. Once you have a solid foundation, then you could move more quickly. And to Steve's point, we can't spend a lot of time at that foundation level, right? We got to at some point fire. And then we can come back and tweak. We can come back and aim, right? But I think it's important to lay that groundwork because, again, if you want to embed this effort in the culture of the organization, there has to be some, you have to have some deliberate steps that you put in place. So, for example, with our effort, we're using the Cotter's framework for change, for leading change. And there are specific steps that you need to do. It doesn't mean that you have to do them sequentially, but certainly you have to start someplace. Like you have to make the case for change. You have to articulate a very clear vision, right? But once you put the infrastructure in place, then I think at that point you could move much more quickly with all deliberate speed.
Thank you so much. Are there any additional comments or questions?
I would just like to say thank you for sharing your journeys. This comes at a really perfect time for me as I'm trying to have this change of lens at my particular school district, and it just means a lot. My hand hurts from taking all the notes. So thank you, and thank you.
Gail and I will place our contact information in a few minutes, but please know you're getting, because there's only 75 minutes, you're getting a really, summary version. They've been through lots of trainings, lots of conversations to understand various things around power and privilege, their own biases, white default. There's so much conversations they've had to have to even understand and be able to see their blind spots and to be able to do something about it. So there's other foundational things that happen in order to even get to a point to where they were able to start to define these concepts. So it's very important to note that if you're going to embark on changing a lens, that it is going to disrupt systems. And the system is going to want to do what the system is going to want to do, right? The system also finds ways to keep you all really busy so you don't have time to do this. Or it keeps you really busy focused on, last night we were with a group of parents that talked about suspensions. And they want something done about suspensions. And we kept trying to tell them you could have something done about suspensions, but the system is still going to continue to oppress Black kids. You have to address the system and the root causes of the system if you really want changes for the upcoming generations, right? It doesn't mean you don't address suspensions now. You can address some things now, but until you change the overall thinking of how you see things in your school district, and the way it structures and operates, it's going to continue because racism is in the design of that system, right? And so that's why we keep having the same conversations over and over and over. If you've been in education for decades now, it's why we keep having the same conversations over and over.
And also to quote Audre Lorde, if you want to tear down the master's house, you can't use the master's tools. So this is a different approach to doing the work. Anyone else have a question or a comment that you'd like to make in the last few minutes?
Ray?
Can we get a copy of those slides? Is it possible?
Sure. I think this is being recorded and you'll have access to it, but we'll make sure and talk to CAAASA of how you can get their definitions. I do want to tell you though, Ray, we do not think you should take them and go, oh, those sound good for us, and adopt those definitions. They are a great place to start, as Pasadena did with Santa Monica, Malibu. But if you notice, they were different because they addressed them differently. So I didn't think you said that, but I just want to put it out in the universe that we don't think you should take these and go, this is what Pasadena and Santa Monica, Malibu are doing. We should adopt these definitions. It is important to go through their process like they went through in defining, in organizing, in strategizing who is going to come up with these definitions. How are you going to try them out? Who are you going to talk to about them? How are you? And that all is part of Kotter's model of organizational change, right? How are you going to develop your base, your support for this foundational work? So I just want to say that out loud for everybody though, Ray. Thank you.
Yeah, it was just as an example. So we have something to start with.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Anyone else, comments or questions for the panel?
I think I see Dr. Moore Washington on this call. I just want to give her a shout out.
Yep, I saw her too. Shout out.
Former assistant soup in our district.
I was just sending a note to you guys, sending my love. It's so good to see you. Great work. I've taken lots of notes.
Thank you, Debbie Moore. Debbie Moore tried to help us with diversity in our hiring and all those other pieces to the puzzle that you have to address through a real systemic change as well in her time with us and even afterwards.
Yay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What's important about what was presented to you today is that it's sustainable. That it's not going to go away because of a line item, or it's not going to go away because people go away, that this lens is sustainable. You just have to make sure it doesn't get corrupted, of course, but that this work is going to be sustainable. And that's what you want, right? There's too much. When I started working in education, people would use the term Kool-Aid. Now I found out some people don't even know what Kool-Aid is anymore. They don't know what Kool-Aids are. They don't know what Slinkies are. I don't know what was going on in this world, but there'd be flavor of the month, right? And in terms of programs. And so you have to remove yourself some sort of that thinking of Kool-Aid of the month and think about what's here to stay and change our perspective and grow. And there takes a level of vulnerability for everybody, even though you may identify as Black African American from the African diaspora, from the Spanish diaspora, colonized, however words that you use to identify yourself, you might have been brought up in this system. And if so, what you've learned is right, the right way to look, the right way to speak, the right way to address a subject, the way that you maybe solution first, all of that you learned in the system. And one of the things to take a vulnerable place is to recognize that you may have to challenge all those things that have worked for you. So with that, Gail has placed in the chat as well as on the screen the emails for myself, I'm Rena Doyle, and Gail Watts, just to take notes of the panel members, Steve Richardson and Florence Culpepper are in Santa Monica, Malibu, and Brian McDonald is in the Pasadena Unified School District. So that is our time.
And we'd very much like to thank Florence, Brian, and Steve for sharing their journey with all of you today. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you to all of you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you all.
We will hang around unless CAAASA cuts us off in case anyone has any comments or questions. We'll just hang around for a few minutes here. If not, we will see
Have a
you
lovely
soon
day.
somewhere. Have a great day.